With less than 24 hours to go until polling stations open their doors, we examine what this election means to you, from the NHS to the cost of living crisis and everything in between. Are the days of politicians getting out and about and meeting people vanishing before our eyes, with stage managed stunts being a key tactic for all parties during this campaign? And Boris is back. But will the return of the former Prime Minister actually cost the Tories votes? I'm Lorna Hughes, and joining me today is Hannah, Rodger and Andrew Quinn. This is Planet Holyrood.
It's important we look at the facts.
Politics has to be about service.
A modern form of national service.
The outcome, that's for the voters to decide.
So it's the final day of campaigning before the big vote tomorrow. Hannah's celebrating, so is Andrew. It's been a long haul for us. Interesting, but hard work. And one of the things that we've got today is a daily record election survey that we've been carrying out over the last few weeks. We've had hundreds of readers responding, and some of the key questions that we've been asking have provided some interesting answers, and very different probably to some of the concerns that voters have had down in England. So, Hannah, I think the thing that got me most was, and we shouldn't be surprised, but it was the percentages. The NHS is the thing that is influencing most people in Scotland. And it's a whopping over 40% of those people that responded. So, you can understand why focusing on that for obviously, the SNP and Labour has been a priority. What else struck you that was interesting?
Well, I think just on the NHS, just for anyone who's not actually seen, the results or the story, I think that we've got on the Record website, which is about this, it's just, of the 9 options, which is the most important issue that will influence how you will vote. And as you're saying, Lorna, rightly, it's the NHS is the number one, with 40% of people saying that. And I think, it's because the NHS, it's not just people now who are waiting for major operations that are affected by waiting times. It's touching every single person. If you need to get a repeat prescription, but you need a test done before it, or you need just to see your GP, it's now impacting every single person on a sort of routine basis. And then also in response to that, people have said, would you say the NHS has improved or declined over the past decades? 90% of the people who responded to our survey said that it's declined, which is just astonishing. But anyway, your question about what else sort of surprised me, I thought it was quite interesting that, interesting but slightly depressing that most people, 25% of people say that they feel that their life has declined or they've become less happy with their life in Scotland compared to 5 years ago, and I think it is quite depressing, but is it that surprising when, personally, I'm still scunnered from the pandemic, never mind, the cost of living crisis and, the everything else. So I suppose that kind of makes sense. And then I also thought that the question about, if elected, do you think that Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak, depending on who you're voting for, would make a good Prime Minister? And most people said no. 60% of people said no. And I just think, that sort of summarizes this whole election campaign, really. I think that people are a bit sort of disenfranchised. They're not really that engaged with this election in the way that we've seen in previous elections, where you've had, people out protesting, people going to confront candidates, really getting engaged. We've just not seen that in this election. And I think...
what's fascinating though, Hannah, is that the question, will you be voting for the same party you voted for in 2019? yes is 57%, but no is 42%, which
yeah. I was quite
certainly,
surprised actually that 57% of people said yes. But then I
Yeah.
suppose, yeah,
I
maybe
think
it's
come
not
tomorrow,
surprising.
obviously it's which party they were voting for, but I think that's interesting that there's a switch as well as people,
I mean,
holding
certainly
on.
there's going to be a good chunk of them that are SNP, given that the SNP got the majority of votes in 2019
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
Scotland. Anyway, sorry, Andrew, I feel like I've just
No,
not
Andrew,
given you a chance.
what struck you the most, Andrew?
I mean, I actually thought what was quite interesting is that the third biggest priority for people when voting in Scotland was, or in our survey, was immigration, which suggests there's something there that isn't really being addressed. I think perhaps in Scotland we think that, or in general, a lot of people think we're maybe a bit more progressive than down south on immigration. But actually, if 1 in 5 voters, it's the biggest issue for them. It shows it's huge, and perhaps that's why.
It could also be, Andrew, that people are thinking of it as in Scotland needs more immigrants rather than trying to prevent it. But
Yes.
It's still an interesting issue. You're right.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem is generally it's not being spoken about on both sides. The SNP maybe mention it a bit more just when they're countering. The Conservatives less than putting out
it's an
their own
attack thing.
Yeah, I don't think either side really, SNP, Labour or the Scottish Conservatives really talk about it at all, when clearly it's a huge issue for people. And I mean, part of that will be part of the reason why Reform are around 6 or 7% in Scotland, so not huge and not going to win any seats this time round, but perhaps laying the groundwork to win seats in 2026 in Scotland. So it's a bit of I was quite surprised by that. I mean, the NHS being a bigger issue than the economy, I think, is crazy, because we are obviously a cost of living crisis at the moment. The last few years, and in the poll as well, more than half of folks said they don't feel like they have enough money to get by. But even then, a lot of folk still think the NHS is a bigger priority. So I guess that does show the state of our NHS. But yeah, that statistic that I've just said, people, more than half of folks saying they don't have enough money to get by. What an awful state of affairs that the country is in. Like, that's more than half of folks. That's not just working class people. That's a lot of lower middle class people as well. Must be a lot of people who own their homes who feel like they don't have enough money. Now, that's a sorry state of affairs, and it shows Labour have a lot of work to do if they do win the election tomorrow.
I think they're very aware of that. I mean, when you go back and, how many food banks have we got in Scotland now? Over 200 food banks. And most of them, are seeing people who are in work actually having to use them. And yeah, it's horrifying. But you're right, Andrew, the fact that the NHS, is right up there is because, as we've talked about, I think it's everybody knows somebody in a waiting list, or somebody who can't get an appointment, or somebody, who's having to go private and spend all their life savings. So, but we can't deal with the NHS properly until we actually get growth, until we actually get the economy kick-started.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting as well, because the NHS has obviously devolved, and this is a Westminster election, but still for 2/5 of people, that's the biggest issue. Now, obviously, having a Labour government rather than a Conservative government is going to affect the funding, and there probably will be more money for the NHS in Scotland under a Labour Westminster government. But I think most people are just so scunnered with it completely that a lot of folk are probably going to give the SNP a bit of a kicking over it, because they don't think their management of the NHS is good either.
Yeah, I think, well, First Minister's questions, that is the common topic, isn't it, between both the Tories and Labour to attack the SNP government with. So, yeah, I just want to touch, Hannah, you mentioned this before, and we were talking about this earlier, about this engagement, in terms of this campaign. And is it an election campaign that's actually not properly engaged with the public, not just on a level of people being disinterested, but actually physically getting out there and meeting, people and politicians? We've so been used to in the past of them, being confronted or stopped by voters, asked questions. It's given us, lots of coverage over the years. Obviously John Prescott famously, had eggs thrown at him. Gordon Brown was accosted. Jim Murphy was, shouted at from when he and we had Gordon Brown obviously being accosted by a woman in the north of England. But we've not seen anything like that at all. Why is that? It seems very stage managed. The only opportunities we get to hear from the leaders are effectively from these TV debates, and we've discussed more the merit of whether they are good or bad. But why is this deliberate, do you think?
Well, the only thing that I remember, and it was right at the beginning of the campaign, was when, I don't know if you remember, but Rishi Sunak was speaking at something, and he did actually get heckled by a woman who clearly knew what she was talking about in terms of the NHS. And she was saying, people are having to be treated or assessed by people who are not qualified. And then, then someone else in the audience said, oh, doctors are too busy on holiday, and that's why they're never in their surgeries. And blooming Rishi Sunak was like properly laughing at this comment, and it just made him look horrendous. But that is actually the only thing that I can think of a politician being sort of, I'm not saying all politicians need to be heckled, it's a campaign, but just as you say, like that sort of engagement that's not just going round the doors, the sort of like soapbox moments where people actually go out in the streets and talk to people. Yeah, we're just not, I don't know. I don't know if...
Do you think our politicians today are, when I say frightened, I mean, but they are unable to actually deal with that? Because certainly a lot of, politicians in the past, whatever party, were able to handle that, some better than others. I mean, it looks now as if it's almost like slightly presidential, isn't it? It's like they cannot be taken out of a TV studio or out of a kind of atmosphere of where they're able to answer questions, obviously with somewhat scripted answers, and being very good at that. I just think we've lost something, Andrew.
Yeah, I do. I think that contributes to people feeling quite apathetic. I think most folk aren't particularly enthusiastic about either choice that we have for Prime Minister. And most folk are probably going to vote Labour because they want change, but it doesn't necessarily mean they think things are going to radically change. And I think they both think that the leaders are a bit out of touch. I mean, certainly Rishi is from a quite well-off background. He's extremely wealthy now. Keir Starmer, not so much. But the fact that he doesn't go out and chew the fat with the public, I think, is bad. And even if someone confronts you, you should be able to listen to them and to set out your own points and say why you believe differently, or at least show folk that you're listening. And I do think it's really bad. I mean, I think security is probably part of the reason. I think security teams are much more wary of it now. But I think also Rishi Sunak doesn't want to go out and do it because he knows the Conservatives' record is absolutely terrible and they will get slaughtered by members of the public on a daily basis. Keir Starmer, I think he probably doesn't want to go out as much because of pro-Palestine protesters. I think he was confronted by some in Glasgow, so he's probably very afraid of that. And John Swinney has been out a little bit more.
Yeah, I was going to say Swinney's definitely, to be fair, has definitely put himself out there.
I would say part of the problem is a lot of the public don't really know who John Swinney is because he's been First Minister for such a little amount of time. I know he was Deputy First Minister, but he's not got the same kind of, I don't know, he's not as high profile as Alex Salmond or Nicola Sturgeon were, or even, I think Hamza Yusuf was more
he's kind of like, sorry, John, but he is sort of the stereotypical grey man, isn't he? I know that. I hope that doesn't sound horrible, but you know, he
We
doesn't.
we did see him in a sports car at the weekend, Hannah, with and a pink hat on. So, you know, he's definitely up for doing stuff like that. But yes, I think undoubtedly that perhaps, you know, is
I don't
an
know as
issue.
well if, you know, the rise in sort of social media and people being caught on camera maybe deters more open and sort of robust discussions like we're seeing for the first time, I think, in an election, is this rise of the Ring doorbell sort of thing.
Right.
You know, I've not seen that in any other election, and it's probably because they've become so popular now. I mean, I did laugh at Theresa May. I don't know if anyone saw this, but she was out campaigning for Luke Graham, who's the Perth candidate for the Tories, and, you know, very politely said, "Oh, hello, I'm Theresa May. I'm campaigning, and seeing as you're not in, I'll just pop a leaflet through your door." And I thought that actually, you know, say what you want about Theresa May, but she's a very polite lady. But then we've seen on the other side, you know, we've seen a postman scrawling racists on the Reform leaflet. We've seen the Labour candidate admitting that they didn't bother to even try back in 2019. You know, and I don't know if that's got something to do with it. Everyone's got a camera in their pocket. You know, you don't know if people are filming you to put it on the internet and or manipulate what you've said. So I don't know if all of these things are just generally sort of like squashing discussion and people's ability to feel like they can have a sort of free conversation.
Yeah, I think also generally it would be Labour doing a little bit more of that, the going out and visiting. But this campaign, they're just like, we do not want to mess up in any way possible. We're being very, very cautious, and I think that's contributed to it. Perhaps it would be different, and say Labour do win tomorrow, and in 5 years' time, perhaps we would see a lot more of Labour going out and chatting to folk, because they'll be a little bit less cautious, because they have been so reserved this time round. Like, you even saw their manifesto, it was nothing new, because they just don't want to rock the boat at all.
Yeah, I think that's frustrated people though as well, because you know, it's like there is that sort of feeling of, you're not telling us the whole truth. You know, you might not be lying to us, but you're not telling us exactly what you're planning to do. Is it because you don't know, or is it because, you know, you want us to vote for you and then you'll reveal your full plans, you know? And I think that's probably not helped with engagement either, because people are like, oh, well, you know, no matter how many times people ask you the same question, you just don't respond. So what's the point?
I think we've seen that when just doing this for the last 5 weeks, we've been talking more about events that have happened and about policies that the parties are actually putting forward. So, yeah, well, we will know at some point in the next couple of days. I mean, he says he's going to hit the ground running. So Gordon Brown has said that the plans in place are huge and, you know, bigger than anything that Tony Blair did. So we will see. But the other person who isn't afraid, of course, to be seen in public and do anything in public is former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And it looks like in a kind of last gasp attempt to avoid, but mitigate complete annihilation tomorrow, Rishi is bringing Boris out on the last day of campaigning, which, considering some of the things that he said in the last few days, surely that's a kiss of death to the Tory party now after a truly dreadful election campaign, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised. I did think at some point they would wheel Boris out. Obviously, they won a huge majority in 2019, and Rishi's not going to do that. So they're like, oh, maybe we can learn something from him. He's so popular with the public. But that's completely forgetting the absolute chaos that happened under him as Prime Minister. And people don't forget about Partygate. We were all taken for a ride, you know. People couldn't see their loved ones as they died, pretty much, and in their last moments, Boris and his aides were partying in Downing Street. It's a disgrace, and I don't think that's going to help the Tories at all. In fact, it just reminds them of how bad it's been. But yeah, it just shows how desperate Rishi is. He's willing to try anything to get more.
I think actually Boris has wheeled the Tories out rather than the other way around. And it may be something to do with the fact that he's got a bloody book coming out in about 2 months' time. You know, I'm very, very cynical about Boris Johnson and his motivations. I think Boris Johnson does almost everything for Boris Johnson, not for the Tory party, not for the good of the country, but for the good of himself. And I think, honestly, if he didn't have this book coming out fairly soon, I doubt he would have appeared, because I don't think his appearance has got anything to do with the election.
Do you think it's not Rishi in the Tory party? It's him. He's managed to wheedle his way in. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I do think so. Because otherwise, you know, I think that if they had sort of managed to convince him to come out and support the campaign, I think he probably would have done it before yesterday. But yeah, the fact that it's at the last minute, I just think that he is all about self-promotion for him rather than anything to do with the election. Because let's face it, like, it's too late in the campaign for him to make really any difference at all. You know,
it's not too late for him to actually lose them a few thousand more votes, though, because as Andrew said, I mean, Partygate, which I don't think Boris will ever understand. I don't think he understands what he did and what was going on at that time, and I don't think he ever will.
Because he probably still doesn't realise that he did something wrong.
No,
you know,
and but I find it astonishing, you know, a Tory party that think that either he can come and join them on the last day and that's fine if that's what he wants to do, or indeed if they have asked him. I mean, I really think it's probably the final nail in a campaign that's been utterly abysmal. Andrew, I mean, do you think it potentially could lose them even a few more thousand votes?
Yeah, because I think a lot of people who were convinced to vote Conservative for the first time because of Boris and because of Brexit feel very betrayed by Boris Johnson. I think they put their faith in him. They thought he was different, even though I guess at the record at Sunday Mail we were saying differently. But a lot of folk thought, look, this is a man of the people. He understands, and they feel completely betrayed. So they were some folk who were maybe still they might have voted Tory again, but held their nose, but this time absolutely not. And some of these folk would have been going Reform, and I think some of them out of spite will be like, no, we're going Labour to absolutely do in the Tories. So I just think the way Boris acted, it just put off so many people. And I think that's part of the apathy as well that we're feeling, is because it's still a layover from Boris. I know we're perhaps not get two great inspiring choices, but the chaotic nature of Boris Johnson really put lots of people off politics. It made you think you could never trust any politician ever because of they just like him and his team lied brazenly all the time. The public remembers that, and the Tories are going to pay for it.
I see. That's what I don't think it's apathy around him. I think it's fury. I think, you know, you produce him, then you know you're just going to lose a few more people, and then a few more people, because the anger that I think is still around him and what happened during that period of time in COVID, I don't think it'll ever go away.
Yeah, the Tories were still, until Partygate, Starmer looked like he wasn't doing very well, actually. They lost the Hartlepool by-election, and it looked like he might have to resign. So it showed just how that really changed the Tories' fortunes. I know Liz Truss was a disaster as well, but Boris was the kind of first thing, hit the Partygate and everything. Yeah,
I do think, though, as much as I think most of us would say, you know, what Boris Johnson did was outrageous and disgraceful, etc., there are still some people who love Boris Johnson, and bringing him out is actually, you know, would probably appeal to them who think, oh, it's just Boris, you know, and who would probably be willing to forgive anything that he did because they just love him so much and his personality and all the rest of it. I can't quite understand those people, but you do see them from time to time saying, oh, Boris, and...
So do you think that John Swinney should call out Nicola Sturgeon from her semi-retirement?
Well, you know, to be honest, I think that I don't think it would do any harm. And I know that's maybe controversial, but I think, you know, for people who support the SNP, I think Nicola Sturgeon will be still seen as an asset and, you know, one of the greatest politicians that Scotland's ever had. And also I think, you know, what I'm realising more and more is it's very easy for us as journalists to think, well, how can people possibly overlook this and that and the next thing? But most ordinary members of the public don't pay as much close attention to all the ins and outs of politics as we do. And therefore, you know, some of the things that have happened within the SNP, you know, people might not necessarily be that aware of the intricate details of it. And they, you know, it might, bringing Nicola Sturgeon out may have, you know, no impact on them whatsoever. And I think there's probably still more people in Scotland who are, you know, favourable towards Nicola Sturgeon than not, which might seem crazy, but I just do think that the you know, the knowledge of the public in terms of what's been happening with the SNP, I think is actually quite low.
I think, you know, she has the ability to be able to provoke, you know, widely different reactions from people, as you say, who absolutely adore her. There's no doubt she was one of the most successful female politicians, you know, in Britain, and people who absolutely, you know, hate her in the same way as there are those that despise Boris Johnson. You know, they are like Marmite politicians, which is what makes them so interesting. Absolutely.
Yeah, she has been out campaigning a little bit. She was in Glasgow East and Glasgow South, I think.
Yeah.
But they've not had.
I don't think she's been seen as Swinney, and
that's obviously been deliberate, hasn't it? They're worried that. I don't know. Maybe they're worried it will remind people about the investigation into the party's finances and things like that, and other controversial policies that they've had. But yeah, I think Hannah's right. There's no politician who's in Scotland who's ever been as popular as Nicola Sturgeon. And if part of the SNP's fear is not getting their core vote out, then Sturgeon would be the one to basically convince them to come out and vote.
Do you know as well who's been missing? Humza.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Humza was brilliant with people.
I know. In fact, Humza, if you're watching this, text me back. Humza Yousaf, you know, I think nobody could deny that he was an excellent people person. You know, even people I've spoken to in, you know, not necessarily SNP leaning or independent leaning groups would say, you know, you put Humza in a room full of our members or supporters or, you know, whoever, staff, and people love him straight away, you know, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to want to vote SNP and support independence immediately, but there's no denying that he had a real charm and charisma with people that is actually quite difficult to achieve in politics, where it comes across as genuine. And I'm really surprised that they've not used Humza. Or maybe
to be fair, his wife is heavily pregnant and obviously expecting, you know, their third baby. So yeah. Well, listen, thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you, Hannah. We will be back tomorrow. We won't obviously have the result, but it'll be interesting. We're getting closer. You can watch Planet Holyrood on the Daily Record YouTube channel, and you can listen to it on Spotify.
It's important we look at the facts.
Politics has to be about service.
A modern form of national service.
The outcome, that's for the voters to decide.